So that's the next slide. So now the word system is troubling, and some people use it very mechanically, but I like to use it as sort of the ecosystem thing. But the thing is, it's a nice way when we think of the food system or health system, it's a nice way to kind of chunk out societies so we're not so overwhelmed, because one of the problems is that you can become so overwhelmed by the complexity of our society, and how do you begin to change it? And lots of us decide, okay, we're going to take this one problem and work on it. But the problem is that if we take that approach, we're not going to be able to change the whole system. And so what we need to do is learn how to see the whole big picture of the food system or the energy system, but be able to figure out where our work fits and how we can support other networks that are working in other parts of the system. We can't shift a whole system without seeing the whole and knowing the networks that are working in those spaces and how we can work together. So here's an example of a network of networks called REAMP, and they are working in the upper Midwest of the United States on climate change, and they're trying to lower emissions. And they found out that they finally decided the work that they were doing, which was shutting down dirty coal plants, that seems really reasonable, right? But when they did a system map, they realized that that was actually making the problem worse. That what was happening is that these coal plants were shutting down, and the communities were building new coal plants that were only a little bit cleaner, just enough to pass the guidelines, and were going to last for a really long time. That strategy really wasn't helping to shift the system to healthier forms of energy production. And so they did a system map, and they realized, oh, we can see 4 different places where if we focus efforts, we can really start shifting the system. And so they started stopping new power plants from being built and working on alternative energy. But they realized that they couldn't do it. A single organization could not work on all of this at once. And so next slide. So what they did is they created a whole set of networks. And the idea is that, with a pulley, think about a pulley. Like if you use a pulley, you can pull down on it and you can lift here 100 kilograms. But if you combine loosely 3 different pulleys, all of a sudden you can lift 4 times the amount. And so that's the idea of networks, just give us so much more power and capacity. Next slide. So what they did was that they formed state networks, and those state networks would get together and figure out, oh, what's changed in our state so that we can see the opportunities for change in our state. And then the regional network, the REAMP network, began to coordinate networks to work from all the states to work on each of these leverage points or opportunity spaces that they identified. And they've had tremendous success. But then they realized after a number of years, oh, what about all these marginalized communities, communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous communities? They're suffering from the current coal production energy more. They're in more cities that are more polluted. They're not getting access to alternative energy. And so they went outside their current network to other networks, such as the Midwest Environmental Justice Network and the Indigenous Indian Collective. And they also began networking with communities on the ground, and they formed another network that's called the Great Lakes Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Network. So you see that even people who think they're a network are really this kind of messy bunch of networks. And so think about your network that you're involved in, and is it really a network of networks? Is it really overlapping with other network efforts? So let's pause now and just look at some definitions. Now, these definitions are not perfect. They're my best I'd be glad for you to rework these or redefine these. But I see that there are two kind of most networks now are either place-based networks. They're in a place like Western North Carolina that's trying to deal with disaster and now recovery. Um, or they're focal point networks. They're focused on a particular, fairly narrow issue or strategy, like we're a network supporting immigrants, or we're a network interested in community gardens. Um, and then there are all these kinds of networks of networks. Now, network of network is just a general term for all the kinds of networks where most of the participants, probably not all of them, are mainly networks rather than organizations. And so there's multiscalar network. I just love that word. It's networks that usually have more than one sort of level from local to state, regional, national, international. They have two or more of those levels involved in their network that usually will have a focus on a particular system or subsystem. Then there's the system shifting networks, which is a term that I just love and would love to see some of these happen. I'm not really sure there are any whole system shifting networks out there. Like, is there a network that's trying to really connect all the climate change networks around the world? If you know of any that are doing things like that, or changing food system, transforming food systems, and working with networks all over the world. So that's a big basket. But I'm hoping that more of that will happen because it's amazing how many, say, groups, environmental groups, are not even barely talking to each other right now, or one's working on education, or any of these sectors that we talked about. Um, uh, there's not nearly as much um, networking among them as I think is really important for us to see. Then there's subsystem networks, which are just a part of a larger system. Like, so in healthcare, you might have a subsystem network focused on national rural healthcare, uh, and so forth. And then there are cross-sector or cross-system networks that include networks from different systems, like Catalyst 2030, or now it's called Catalyst Now, that's working on the Sustainable Development Goals, would be an example of that. But there's also lots and lots of learning networks or communities of practice that are really cross-sector, and they're bringing together people from different networks. And then there's the really important field building, capacity building, or support networks that are trying to serve, a lot of networks out there. Places like Phyto Network, and if you aren't familiar with them, check out that link there and check them out because they're really providing support and bringing together, convening lots of different networks. Um, so next slide. So that's now if you have some other kinds of networks that you've seen, let me know. But now let's talk. So why do we have to have all these complicated different kinds of networks? And it's because even though our current networks that are mostly focused, somewhat narrowly, you can get a lot of things done. You can get some really exciting work there. But what I've found is I've been like interviewing networks and talking to networks and networks that you need more outside perspectives. And you can get that in a network of networks. You need to do intense learning. I feel like part of the reason we're not making as much progress as we want is that we need to be doing much more deep learning to figure out what's working, what's not, what are the patterns of success. How can we get out of our dominance mindset and the way it blinds us and seeing what needs to be done? And we need to be sharing with each other what we're doing. So many groups are innovating so incredibly beautifully, but they don't have any venues or places or platforms where they can share not what they're doing, but what they're learning, what breakthroughs they're making, what innovations they're making, and sharing that with others. Um, And people need support with challenges. I've come across so many groups and they say, oh, we have this problem. I said, oh, have you talked to so and so? They've already dealt with that challenge. Let me connect you with them because they'll be able to tell you what they did. And I bet you can learn something from them. And if we ever want to do really large scale kinds of things, we have to be connected, more connected. Now, and we also need to develop what I call the support ecosystem. We have to figure out communications. We have to figure out how to support all the network weavers we're going to need. And it's best to work on that with other networks. Most single networks don't have the capacity to figure all that out. So there's lots of reasons. Now, the key, of course, is how do we do this without being overwhelmed? And, that's part of what we're going to have to learn together. So let's, a couple things though. Networks and networks generally differ from networks because networks and networks tend to not just say, this is our strategy, we're going to do it. A lot of networks have a strategy or a little set of strategies they're doing. But networks and networks are often like, oh, we want to bring together all these networks with different strategies so they can learn from each other and be provoked by each other and really, help see where each is working in that big giant network map. And I just want to get the idea that it's not like there's a recipe for a network of networks. So in the US, there's this food policy network of networks, and it has a lovely vision. It's trying to create a more just food system. Next slide. And there are 300 and some local and state and regional policy networks. So it's a multiscalar network. It has, local, state, regional, and national. Next slide. And it does a bunch of things, but the main thing it does is it's a learning network and sort of a practice network. And so people want to learn something like I did one for 6 months or something on network weaving and how can you build healthier networks in your local communities. But they have all sorts of different ones about different strategies and different policies that people have done in one community and then they're sharing it with others. But it's quite structured. It has a staff of a couple people and they do most of the coordination. So next slide. But every 18 months they do like, what have we been able to accomplish as a whole network? And it's really quite astounding, all the different policies on the many different levels that have been passed. So, example of a somewhat structured. And then next slide. Then the next one, so next slide. So I'm just going to real quickly go over these so you have time to ask questions. So we talked about this. You've got to find out who's out there and find it. Just stop with the blinders so you're not overwhelmed and say, okay, I'm going to be overwhelmed once in a while, but I'm going to find out who's out there working on. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of networks out there, and if you can start to get some of these, I'd really. And if you want a list of funders that support networks, go to FITO Network. They have a whole section with about 50 funders that support networks. So just FITO, FITO .network, I don't know. Anyway, something like that. So really, the thing about these network weavers, now you may have heard that term, it's about, it is not a job, it's not a role, it's something it's a role, I guess, that everybody in a network can play, and some will play it with more skill and spend more time on it than others, but everybody needs to understand network weaving, and if you don't, there's good stuff in that network weaver handbook thing that about how you explain and talk about that. But these network weavers, you need network weavers in your network that are focused on other networks. Next slide. And go on to the next one because those are the books that you can. There's other places on the blog that you can learn about this too. And then you've got to really focus on building relationships. And so, next slide. What I suggest is, and if you don't know this closing triangles thing, it's really like if you go out and you talk to somebody in another network, you listen to them and you find out what's their challenge, what are they interested in, and you say, oh, I know somebody in my network who's into that too. And you begin to bring them together. So you don't become a hub, but you're starting to bring together people, and you might help them talk to each other so that they start thinking about, oh, well, who else is interested in this? What could we do? Could we get a learning group together to talk about this? And so it's just like magic. All of a sudden, you've got self-organizing starting to happen. So next slide. And so this shift to self-organizing, I'm telling you, this is the piece that is is so undeveloped. And I want you to all think about trying to add this to your network as well as networks of networks. It really works for networks of networks. So this is when you connect people, they find something that they want to do together or learn together, and you support them and help make something happen. You learn from whatever it is you do, and you share that with others. So next slide. It's just so basic. Now, yeah, I'm going to skip over this a little bit, but when you bring people together, and this is something network weavers have to be able to do, facilitators of every meeting, they need to be, having breakout rooms where people can get to know each other. They need to practice a healthy culture, a culture, a trauma-free culture, a culture where you're going to get listened to, where you're going to support each other, you're going to interact as peers. Next slide. And you can do this. I have a values checklist that's great where people can take it and they can say, oh, wow, yeah, we're really open to new ideas, but oh, we do have a little trouble letting go of control. Well, then they get together and say, what can we do about that? And they then get some strategies that can help build that culture. Because without that culture, we're going to keep falling back into competitiveness, into being impacted by trauma, into being angry or, whatever. And so we have to keep helping people move into a culture of caring and support. Next, and collaboration. And there's all these microprocesses that some of them are in the handbook that can help people. Every meeting can have these microprocesses where people are encouraged to behave in these really healthy ways. I'm finding that transformation is about small things. It's about people consistently interacting in healthy ways with each other, day after day, and that begins to spread. And we don't have time to talk about that here, but there's ways you can help that kind of culture spread. And that is what can be a big part because when you do work and you know how to interact really in healthy ways, you're going to not waste time on, getting bogged down in conflicts that you don't pay attention to. You'll know how to deal with stuff like that, and you'll know how to make that be more like a sneeze than pneumonia. Next slide. So then there's lots of different ways you can assess, you have a couple networks out here now. You have to find these opportunity spaces or interests, and you can use surveys, you can do simple network system mapping, and I've got some resources here, and there's actually people on this call, system innovation and stuff, people can help you with. Next slide. And some of the best work's being done, oh, anyway, we don't have time for that. Next one. But there's lots of people doing great things on system mapping and then how to identify the networks. So then you can start convening like really small things, like how do I get young people involved? And so get people from 5 different networks who want to get young people more involved. And maybe they meet once, maybe they meet 3 times, maybe they meet for 6 months. You can call it a community of practice or a learning cluster, or whatever, but you start bringing people together. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time. You can have a pretty standard agenda. People share, they get support for challenges. It can be a pretty simple process. And then when you get your $1 million, next slide, this whole thing about starting to get, you find, wow, here's a opportunity space where if we got a bunch of people working, we could really start to figure out how to shift this food system or whatever. And so getting people together once a month from maybe all over the world, maybe, all over the country, and getting them to behave in some of these new ways while they're sharing and learning from each other. Again, we need we need our facilitators and network weavers to really know how to lead learning processes and how to do that. It's not just about, oh, what went well, oh, what could we change. No, it's digging in and really looking at. We need to spend so much more time noticing what we're doing, and figuring out next steps. Okay, a few more things here. We'll get some questions. So this support ecosystem, this is like, I'm a gardener. I have a very little yard, but I have a wonderful garden, and I spend a huge amount of time getting the soil, putting lots of different nutrients in it, and getting my compost that I make and all that. And the plants respond and they really grow like other people. I look at their gardens and they're like little straggly things because they haven't invested in the enabling conditions or the support ecosystem. We've got to start thinking together about this, and we do not have this figured out. But we really need to get, like, what are these new kinds of network weavers that are ambassadors, that are connectors across networks? What does that look like? How do we support them? How can we begin to bring them together monthly? That's a big thing that we need to start with soon. And then the communication ecosystems, and I'm going to let Anna talk about this because we're trying to figure out, what does a communication ecosystem that allows us to know what's going on in all these networks and yet be able to not get overwhelmed. Anna, you want to talk a little about this?
Yeah, so me and Christina, we are part of the project called Social Roots. We're co-hosting this event with June. So Social Roots is a software platform that's run as a worker-owned co-op, and we got funded by the National Science Foundation to basically spend about 5 years researching this topic of what is preventing people from self-organizing in networks of networks, and what are the processes and technologies that are going to help. And what we learned was, in a nutshell, that basically most software is built hierarchically, and it's built to have 2 levels of self-organization instead of 3. So if you think about like Slack or project management tools or any sort of chat tools, they're made for one organization to use at a time. They're fundamentally sold to one organization. That's how they build the whole system. And it's a very hierarchical system. And then the second category of technologies out there is kind of social media. So if you think of Twitter and Mastodon and Facebook, and those are built fundamentally as public squares, and their business model is ad revenue. And basically, there's not really a sense of any sort of community space. So then what we've seen communities use is things like portals, forums, listservs, and those are working better, but they're fundamentally siloed. And so you can't have that kind of multi-fractal subsetting and supersetting that you have to have agency and be able to scale across. Because fundamentally, there's always one person who owns everything, and one person can delete the whole Slack group, or can delete the whole Facebook group, or can delete the whole portal. And that really makes it hard to get people to feel motivated, because everybody wants to have some control over their work, over their information, their knowledge, their relationships. So basically, what Social Roots is doing, and we invite anybody who wants to join us to to participate in whatever way you want to, but basically we're building technology to break down this paradigm of hierarchy or completely public, and really build infrastructure that enables like scaling across, that's allowing autonomous networks of groups to both subset and superset, but with healthy boundaries.
Wow. Yeah, so I think we're going to do some experimenting with it when we work on the workbook that's going to come out of this. Okay, so next slide. Oh, let's go on the next slide. I've got and I've got bonus slides. So when we will set up like a YouTube channel or something like a play space, the Social Roots YouTube channel, and I will put a link to these slides. You're allowed to take them, edit them, do whatever you want with them. You can attribute if you want to, but some of it maybe you don't want to be connected to. Okay, so then the last piece is just it's so important that we share. Like, so we do something with a networks of networks. It's probably going to be just a very small subset of all those networks. Networks tend to be often big and sprawly. So we have to have ways to really turn what we learn into knowledge and really share it. And we've got to stop using webinars to tell people what we're doing and instead tell them what we're learning and give them time to figure out how to apply it to what they're doing. I feel like that we have to create these pathways for rippling. I call it, instead of scaling, it's like pathways for rippling or spreading, and we need to learn more about what kind of knowledge is really useful to each other, because I think we put a lot of stuff out there and waste a lot of people's time reading through stuff to get to the little nugget that's really going to be useful for our network. So anyway, that's just another piece of this network of networks piece that I don't want people to forget about. So next slide. I think we're just about, yeah. So next slide. So this is my new sort of model of transformation, very simplified. You can look at this later, and I think that this could make a huge difference in the world. But it really, networks of networks that are connecting is at the heart of this whole model. And so we need to figure out and learn how to know what's happening in that whole network space around the world. So next slide. It's not just networks, it's networks of networks, and all the way up, all the way down.